Before we start looking at how we include CSS alongside our HTML, let's have a look at the syntax, the way we write CSS. CSS comes in what we call property value pairs. By that we mean we write two things at a time. We write the thing that we want to style and the way that we want to style it. Let's take a look at an example. Here's the HTML for the web page. Inside of my body tags, I have an article which includes a header, an H2, and a couple of paragraphs. In my CSS file, I'm going to add a background color to this article. The first thing that we need to write is article itself. This is the element that we want to change the look of. This is called the selector. We'll come back to this part in a minute as there's a few ways to write it. After we've written the selector, we open curly braces. This encompasses all the property value pairs we want to write for that element. So we must remember to type a closing one after we've finished. In this example, the property that we want to change on the element is background color. It's pretty self-explanatory. It will set the color of the background for this article. The value we set here is just a color, deep pink. Each property, this background color is the property, has its own set of values. There are color values, unit values, keyword values. There are lots of different ones. Over this course, we will visit most of them and discuss how to use them. As you can see, now our article has got this deep pink background color. Let's take a look at what happens if we change that value. The background color has in fact changed. Let's take a look at another example. Not only can you set a background color for an element, but you can also set a background image. Now you can see the article has an image as a background instead. I've kept the color in 2 just because the image might not load or it might take a while to load, so we want to have a similar color being shown in the meantime. You'll see the value for the property background image is slightly different than just a word. It uses URL and then opens brackets. Whenever you see a word and brackets directly afterwards in CSS, this is a function and it will do something special. In this case, it's going to load the image for us. Let's talk about the article part, the selector. This means the CSS is going to go to the HTML and find all the article elements and apply the CSS that we have written within these curly braces. There are different selectors that we can use. So here we have an element as a selector. We're typing article specifically. We could have header or H2 or paragraph or any of the elements that we've seen in the previous chapter. If I change that element, it changes where it puts the styles in the HTML. Instead of using an element for a selector, we could use a class. A class is a common attribute we use in HTML. We saw it in the previous part. As you can see in my HTML here, the first paragraph has got 2 classes, lead and callout. We know there are 2 because there is a space between them. So I could use the class as a selector in this instance, but I don't just type the class name. I have to put a full stop or a period before it. This is true for any class that you want to use. Now it's going to add these styles to the paragraph with the class of lead, which is just this first paragraph in our HTML. I could have, because this paragraph has 2 classes, used the class callout instead. As you can see, it's the same paragraph. Another type of selector that we can use is an ID. Again, this top paragraph has got an ID associated to it. It has this attribute ID feature. So I could write feature for the selector at the top here, but when we use an ID, we have to remember to include a hash symbol before it. You can use any ID on any element. However, you can't use 2 IDs that are the same. So I can't have another element in my HTML with an ID of feature. I can, however, reuse classes. So I can have another class of lead in the paragraph below this first one. So now if I change that selector back to lead, it's going to style both of the paragraphs with a class of lead. Be careful when using IDs as they are unique and they carry a lot of weight when it comes to CSS. We'll talk about that later in the course. We've already seen that we could use either class. We can use lead or callout. But what happens if your CSS contains both of these classes? So at the top, I write my styles for all the lead paragraphs in my HTML, and then underneath it, I use the class callout with a different background color. Because the top paragraph has both classes on it, both of these CSS styles that I've written are affecting it. A really easy way to check this is by using DevTools. If I right-click on the paragraph I want to look at and choose Inspect, bear in mind that I'm using Chrome browser, it opens up a panel which shows me the HTML here in the top part and the CSS that's affecting it here in the bottom part. This is extremely useful for when you're writing code. So if we look at this paragraph, P, class, lead, and callout, and then look at the styles below, callout has a background color of green, and lead has a background color of deep pink. We can see that the background color of green is affecting that paragraph over the background color of deep pink. This is because it's written last in our CSS. Our CSS runs from top to bottom. So it does apply deep pink, but then it gets overridden because it implies green afterwards. Another thing to consider when writing your styles and using the same selector, so instead of callout here, I might use the P selector to change it to background green. This hasn't worked for the top paragraph because different selectors carry different weights. Again, let's have a look in DevTools. This P class lead, if we look down below, has a background color of deep pink and the background color of green, but the order's been swapped over, which can be very confusing because we already know that the CSS runs from top to bottom. This is because a class, as a selector, holds more weight than a paragraph. And so both of these styles are being applied, but because the class is being used for the top one, that's the one that's overriding the other one in this instance. It's the same for IDs. In fact, IDs hold the most weight. So if I use the ID, even though that's written first and should be overwritten by what is written below it, with the background color deep pink and the background color green, it in fact is overriding both of those because I'm using the ID as the selector. We'll find ways later on when we do the lab for this course of writing our CSS in a good order so we don't stumble with this feature of CSS. There's a couple more things to note about selectors. As you can see, we have multiple paragraphs on this page. So if I use the P as a selector, it's added the background color green to all of them. This can actually be very useful, maybe not for background colors, but for font size, for example. If I change this property to font size, it's changed the font size of all of the paragraphs on my page at once. The value that I've used with the font size property here is a unit value, and there's lots of unit values and we'll cover them in the course. However, you might have a situation where you want one paragraph to have a bigger font size than all the others. This is where our classes come in useful. That top paragraph still has our class of callout, and on just that top paragraph I can reset the font size to be bigger. and it will just affect that top paragraph. This is what we refer to as the cascade. Depending on what selector you're using affects how many elements on the page you want to style. And you can get more specific as you work your way through. Let's talk about styling more than one selector at a time. It could be that we want a background color on both of our paragraphs and our headers. What we can do is we can select them together by using a comma between the selector part in our CSS. What this is saying is please style both the paragraphs and the headers. Remember, comma is and. Another thing to note is to remember our HTML tree, our parents and our children. Our H2 is a child of our header, which is a child of our article. Our paragraphs are also a child of our article. We have a paragraph in the footer, which is a child of our article. It might be that you want to style just the paragraphs in the article and not the footer. We can do that by using a space. So I've chosen the article as my selector, and then I've added a space and P. And this is now looking at all the paragraphs within the article, but not the footer. So the rule is a comma for and, a space for inside. Now we've seen how we write CSS. One more thing to note about CSS is how to write comments. It's the same as HTML we saw before. These get overlooked by whatever is reading the CSS file, but they can be really handy for adding notes to our CSS file. We write a / and a star, and then another star and another /. Then we can write our comment inside. Now that we've seen how to write CSS, let's take a look at how we link it with our HTML file so that it can see it.